Welcome to a special election edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette. The upcoming November 4th elections include contests for 3 statewide offices, as well as the key issue of which party or what coalition will control the New York State Senate. While there are limited races here in the city, New Yorkers will also be voting on 3 ballot proposals, which means that this election day will impact the everyday lives of Manhattanites. We've assembled a special panel to discuss the races and issues that Manhattanites and New Yorkers should be aware of as Election Day approaches. Joining me today are John Kenney, publisher of NewYorkTrue.com, a website focused on New York politics, Linda Sarsour, co-founder and president of the Muslim Democratic Club of New York, and former Assembly member and now political columnist Michael Benjamin. Thank you all for being here. So let's jump right into the big ticket headliner race, the governor's race. Governor Cuomo seeking a second term. What are his arguments for re-election? Does he deserve a second term? What do we see as we approach Election Day?
Well, his essential argument for re-election is that he's made state government work again, that he's taken a chaotic and uncontrolled legislature and made it function in a way that, in his view, benefits New Yorkers. And certainly he has exerted an amount of control and pressure on the state legislature that prior governors, especially his 2 immediate predecessors, did not. And that's the core of his re-election argument. There are specific things that he points to, among them his budgets being on time for 4 years in a row, and other topics that he'll point to, but really the essential theme of it all is that he's made state government work.
State government works again. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you see as his selling points, or what arguments is he making that resonate with you?
I mean, for me personally, you know, he should have done a lot of things that he's promising us this time that I think could have easily been done before, with his work and with his push around the New York State Dream Act, the Women's Equality Agenda. I think that there was a lot of, around the Working Families Party, you know, kind of drama that happened. He was promising us things that he should have been doing anyway as a Democrat. I think one thing for me that I will say I'll give him some credit for, or all the credit for, working with allies across the state, is creating the Office of New Americans, which I think, again, for a Democrat and for the state to then create an office that specifically focuses on integration and working with new immigrants was for me and for my community at least a very important initiative, and I hope that it stays on even beyond Cuomo if he gets a second term. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, I can see his arguments of why he wants a second term. We don't really have a lot of good choices right now, so we hope that he does get his second term. Mm-hmm. But I think he has a lot of work to do to really, if he has future aspirations, to show us what he can do in the next 4 years.
So you sort of fall into the camp that was touched upon maybe in his Democratic primary, that he needs to remember more of his Democratic base as he moves forward?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
I really haven't seen much of an argument or a rationale for a second term, honestly.
Yeah?
The fact that he's backed away from his whole anti-corruption effort, backing away from moral and using it only as a cudgel in some senses or a hammer in another sense, it lets us just go along with some of the things he wanted to do, and backing away from that, now having U.S. Attorney Barra take it over, you know, tells me that he didn't accomplish that particular task. His efforts around simplifying government, it came into office talking about these thousands of other smaller governments across the state. He's done very little to consolidate, at least force consolidation. I think when you look at across the state, the number of school districts that are losing students, but they still exist, and the burden that they're placing on small villages and towns, we need to look at some level of consolidation. He hasn't really done that, and he hasn't made that part of his campaign this year. So I'm not quite sure exactly what his agenda is or what's his rationale. Recently he spoke to a group of Baptist ministers. Suddenly he's talking about an Office of Faith-Based Services. Mm-hmm. Well, we already do these sort of things. A number of faith-based services are already funded by the state, whether it's Catholic charities or groups that are run by Protestant agencies or ministers. They're done already. So why do we need a particular office for, other than, in my view, an election year pandering to drive out a black and minority vote for a guy who really wants to grind Astorino into the ground?
Mm-hmm. And now you've been following some of the governor running on this Women's Equality Party line and the Women's Equality Agenda.
Correct.
What's happening there?
Well, there's almost like a sub-drama going on there. It's the case that there doesn't appear to be a real race between Andrew Cuomo and Rob Astorino, with a 20-point difference in polls and not a lot of movement in the polls in the last, well, months even, much less in the last few weeks. But there is drama around the multiple ballot lines that Andrew Cuomo is running on. So it's really Cuomo versus Cuomo versus Cuomo versus Cuomo. There's Andrew Cuomo on the Democratic Party line. There's Andrew Cuomo on the Independence Party line. There's Andrew Cuomo on the Working Families Party line. And then there's Andrew Cuomo on the Women's Equality Party line, which, notwithstanding its name, is a ballot line that he's created this election, which is permissible under the New York State election law, basically by filing an appropriate number of petitions. And candidates in New York like to do it usually around a particular topic or ideological issue. So it may be that whether it's around, in this election, Rob Astorino want to stop Common Core ballot line, but taxpayer party type, where the name may grab voters who show up to vote or somehow attract someone who wouldn't vote on that line.
Is this all more pandering? Is it all these lines? Is that? I mean, you brought up.
In my particular view, I mean, the very fact that Dylan did a series on the Independence Party showing what a sham it is for the governor to then take their line. And during the last week, he talked about reforming Wilson Preclude, in fact, doing away with it, that allows cross-party endorsements. He's going back on a great deal of what I believe he had talked about by, number one, forming the Women's Equality Party, taking Independence Party line, making his deal with the WFP, and then stabbing them in the back by creating the Women's Equality Party. It just seems like a crazy sort of thing he's been trying to do, and trying to have, have his cake and eat it too.
Right.
And that's not satisfactory.
Yeah, a lot of politics.
I mean,
at
as a
play
woman,
here.
for me, it's like instead of integrating women or integrating immigrants or integrating other kind of voter blocks into the Democratic Party and bringing them in all under kind of one banner to separate voters and believing that women are only going to vote because we care only about women's rights or women's reproductive rights, I don't think, for me personally, is a sophisticated way or sends to me the message that I'm part of the larger voter bloc that someone like Cuomo or any other elected official should be courting. I just don't think that I want to send women and continue to marginalize women in politics and put them into their own box. I mean, I'm tired of that. Like, if the message is let's empower women, let's bring women, let's do women's equality, let's all be under one banner, whether it be the WFP banner or the Democratic Party. Just bring us all together. I'm not into this separating people based on either their ethnicity or their immigration status or their new immigration status or gender.
But now, to the same point, that he does have the women's equality agenda. He has a 10-point plan that has not been passed yet in its entirety, and he is really focused on this as an election issue.
Correct, and there are a lot of things wrapped up in it. First is the actual 10 points in his plank, with a couple of them being very significant social policy issues and ones that have received widespread attention. Those top two being pay equity and abortion rights and codifying them. Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court case, basically said that states could not have their own laws prohibiting abortion. So if Roe v. Wade were to be repealed someday by the Supreme Court, whether that's in a day, a month, or a decade, states, excuse me, states would be free to enact their own laws, or potentially free to enact their own laws around abortion and the right to an abortion. So at the moment, it's a legal question that doesn't really matter in New York, but it could theoretically matter. But what it's done is given Andrew Cuomo a vehicle to further a number of his aims. First, he gets to campaign actively, and he gets to campaign actively away from all of the parties whose line he's on, including the Democratic Party and the Working Families Party. He gets to project himself as the protector of abortion rights, a view that a majority of New Yorkers, a solid majority of New Yorkers, are with him on, but that his opponent, Rob Astorino, is not. And it's a very clear choice. There's none of the messy nuance and issues that come with all sorts of other things, including when you've moved things through the legislature. There's all sorts of deal making, trading, so that every accomplishment comes with a little bit of mess around the edges.
Compromise, yeah.
And there's none of that. It's a very clear issue that a majority of New Yorkers support him on. And there's also, excuse me, the look ahead, which is that should Andrew Cuomo ever really seriously consider running for president, showing up in Iowa, New Hampshire, and other states where abortion rights are under attack on a daily basis from Republican-controlled legislatures and Republican governors, it does give him another arrow to pull out to say that I've fought for abortion rights in New York. And if you're in Texas, which is a favorite punching bag for the Women's Equality Party, if you're a Democratic voter in Texas or Missouri or any of the other states where those rights are under attack, that may be something that resonates. So it may ultimately play well for him on a little bit longer game.
Multiple levels. I mean, that's a long game we won't get into too much now, but it's a very valid point in terms of the politics at play. So to be clear, on the women's equality agenda, these 10 points, most Republicans in the legislature have been on board with the first 9. So, you know, that's this 10th plank about codifying Roe v. Wade that you brought up. So speaking of Republicans, so we've got the Republican candidate for governor, Rob Astorino, who we've touched on. There's a Republican candidate for attorney general, for comptroller. All 3 are facing incumbent Democrats in a pretty Democratic state. So is there sort of hope on the Republican side for any of these 3 to pull out a victory? Is there, what do you see the status of the Republican Party in New York? You know, what's...
I'm laughing because I don't believe the Republican Party has a real status in New York, only because the state party hasn't really driven their candidates. I believe that there's a shot of them winning and retaining some level of, retaining control of the state Senate without the IDC. I think that definitely does exist based on the current polls. And upstate, there is a resentment towards the governor for a variety of reasons, whether it's Common Core or it's his SAFE Act, other things many people outside of Buffalo and outside of Rochester disagree with him on. And there's enough campaigns that are going on in support of the Republican candidates for state Senate where they have a shot at winning. And some of the candidates are actually not crazy. They're reasonable people. George Amador, who I know from the Assembly, reasonable guy. He's a businessman. He had his own housing construction company. You know, they're reasonable people. They're not crazy.
State Senate candidates.
State Senate candidates, and they're people who could be elected. It's up in the air as to what happens with the Greg Ball seat. Greg Ball was a bit of a wild card, even for the Republicans. He was a bit of a wild card. So there's some chance maybe the Democrats might pull something out. But I don't think the Democrats are that strong in parts of upstate where the Republicans may just win 4 seats or 5 seats and retain absolute control and not even need the IDC for them to remain to be that. I think in the governor's point of view, I think he would like to see Republicans in charge, only because it splits government.
Right, that's what I was about to ask
And you avoid
that,
some of the more, not necessarily progressive, I would say leftist views of some of the members of the state Senate. And the Republicans, since they've been in power for so long, they actually have a mechanism where they can actually get things accomplished and know what's going on. What happened to the Democrats a couple of years ago when they were in charge, they really had been out of power for so long, they hadn't developed a really great staff to allow them to hit the ground running and to enact legislation. And that's what hurt them. And then they had the crazy infighting that took place. And one last thing I want to say about the governor's Women's Equality Party and the 10-point agenda, the abortion plank is a red herring. Abortion is not going to be something that's going to be under attack in New York. Republicans support abortion choice. They may say something else when they're in their district, but by and large, nobody's ever put legislation in to end abortion in New York. That's not going to happen. It's an effort by the governor to get an advantage over Republicans, to get votes from women. But abortion, and what he wanted to do was to decriminalize abortion. Well, what do you do with abortion doctors who violate the law? They couldn't be criminally prosecuted if you do away with abortion in the criminal law, because nobody was going to prosecute a woman who had an abortion or had a late-term abortion, or even her doctor. So it was always, in my view, that's always been a red herring.
The control of the state Senate here, I mean, this is, you know, assuming the governor gets reelected, which again, you know, it seems like that's what polls and we're pointing to, an incumbency is so strong, that could hurt the chances of the DREAM Act and some of these other progressive pieces of progressive legislation. What do you see happening? I mean, and do we think the governor might prefer that so that he doesn't have to fully follow through with sort of the left progressive agenda?
I mean, I come from a part of New York. I mean, we talk about New York City a lot, and we're like, oh, we don't really have a lot of these races that we have to really watch in New York City. I come from a part of New York City which is Republican-run. I mean, I have Senator Marty Golden, who's very powerful in the New York State Senate. My assembly person is a Republican. My congressman is a Republican. So we have to always not talk about it also from the context of upstate. Let's look at the upstate. Let's look at the downstate. And for me, I think there's a lot of skepticism, and that's what you brought up, which is, you know, does Cuomo want to pass all these things? You know, is he going to try to push hard for them? But if it's still a Republican, you know, run Senate, the political environment is not there for him. He doesn't have the allies. And even on the IDC, like, is the IDC really not going to be around anymore? Like, there's a lot of skepticism amongst immigrant communities that is true. And will that be used as an excuse again to not pass things like the New York State Dream Act? Like, come on, really? Like, we've had New Mexico, California, so many states have passed Dream Acts, and New York State hasn't been able to figure out how to pass the New York State Dream Act. So there's a lot of skepticism in immigrant communities, and we're trying to figure out, like, what are the issues that we can pull out people to the polls. People are just like, we don't care anymore. Like, we're not getting what we want, and we're just trying to find that little inspirational, motivational piece to bring people out to the polls. And to be honest, for us, it's hard. We haven't really found it, and just getting people to say your vote matters, it doesn't matter, what potentially happened. This is a long-term game. You got to look at this long-term. We talk about this like 10-year trajectory because people can't see it tomorrow. They can't see it in January.
Is there any consideration, you're talking about some of the Democratic base here and people you work with and people you help lead. And is there any consideration on going to Cuomo's left in the general election, voting for a Green Party candidate in Howie Hawkins? I mean, do you hear any talk? You do?
Oh my God, yes. And I think that people are getting to the point where it's not about being politically strategic anymore. It's about, we have to send a message. How do you send a message? It's about being principled. Like, is the reason why we're in the situation that we're in right now is because we're always trying to be politically strategic? People are like, look, we have another choice here. Let's go there. And we're trying to bring people back to the larger Democratic and telling people, if you want to vote left, let's go Working Families Party then. But people are really fed up. They, for us in the Muslim community on Muslim spying by the New York Police Department, we had a governor who was silent. He said nothing. Then we had a whole, massacre in Gaza. Our governor chose to go to Israel, but did not take the invitation of the Palestinians. This has resonated in a community who feels like they've been marginalized and that this governor particularly hasn't courted this particular vote.
Not necessarily on those last couple of issues you mentioned, but on some of the frustration with the governor. This is, of course, where a little bit, at least, of the groundswell around Zephyr Teachout in the primary came, and she has obviously not made an endorsement in the governor's race. I think there's reason to believe she might get behind Howie Hawkins in the Green Party line. I don't know how much airtime we necessarily want to give to talking about how he'll do, but as a third-party candidate, the latest poll had him at about 9%. Is there any chance he makes a little noise here at 10+%?
It seems unlikely in the end. Last time, it was a great victory for Howie Hawkins in 2010 when he got about 59,000 votes, thereby earning the Green Party a fixed ballot line for 4 years. And that represented, I think, just under 1.5% of the vote. It does seem likely that he'll go up from that on a few counts, part of it being the Zephyr Teachout inspired voters who are really driven by fracking and more specifically by opposition to fracking, as well as some more general discontent around the governor. But if you're well to the left and your discontent is something that's probably been there for a long time, and it doesn't seem driven so much by Zephyr Teachout as by other issues. But I think she does, her primary campaign will boost him somewhat. It seems unlikely that he'll end up as high as he is in that most recent Quinnipiac poll at 9%, but certainly well above where he was before. And it does go back to that subdrama of Cuomo versus Cuomo versus Cuomo versus Cuomo, and where these votes end up and how it changes from 2010, where the Working Families Party earned about 154,000 votes, and they were actually ahead of the Independence Party. That certainly seems unlikely, or at least the prospect is good that that will not happen this time, at least from pressure by Andrew Cuomo pushing votes away from working families toward the Women's Equality Party. But then whether there's enough discontent to fill that reduction.
One thing I wanted to say.
Sure.
We can't really compare a Democratic primary to a statewide race with Republicans that are running. And so I think while the Green Party may not make 10 to 12%, they will get some votes. We're still looking at the fact that CSEA and other state workers are angry at the governor, and they will cast a vote against the governor. Maybe not for Rob Astorino, but maybe for Howie Hawkins. Last night on New York One, you had retiring President D37 talk about the fact she didn't endorse for governor, and they're allied with CSEA. So their workers may vote for governor as a Democrat, or they may vote for someone else or not cast a vote at all in a gubernatorial race. Because we also forget that machines have changed. It's not where you can vote down the line because you're voting in a voting machine. You're voting on a Chinese menu, basically. Pick one from column A, one from column B, and people I think, have a greater choice. And we haven't really talked about that, how the new ballot can change voter behavior and give them a greater choice and decide where they want to vote and how they want to vote. So
That's
I
interesting.
think something can turn out differently.
And that does go back to Rob Astorino's problem. And indeed, our conversation is really not
He's
about
on multiple ballot lines as well.
Astorino. Right, but his hope, certainly his stated hope around the primary, was that these Zephyr Teachout voters, at least some of them, would come to him. But that seems very unlikely because to the extent that they're left of center, they have both, if they're willing to vote for the governor, but want to send a message, they have the Working Families Party line. Now they have the Women's Equality line. And they do have not so much a plausible to win candidate, but a plausible protest candidate in Howie Hawkins who will draw some of those votes, again leaving Astorino really without much of a gain or a pickup from the Zephyr Teachout insurgency that did damage the governor in some ways, but ultimately not that will help Astorino.
Now, Astorino's hitting the governor a lot on the Moreland Commission, which you brought up, Michael, earlier. Is that enough to resonate with people, sort of this anti-corruption or anti-corruption commission, the way that it was handled? Is that something you hear about, or is it more about issues? I mean, is it more about sort of forward-looking issues and not the way?
I think in the communities that we work in, which are predominantly what we call, quote, new Americans, I think Moreland Commission may not be the word that people use, but corruption's a big deal. Like every single day you hear about another Democrat, another Republican that's being, indicted for fraud or for giving money to another nonprofit. And I think that resonates with people because people are like, these are my taxpayer dollars. Where's that accountability? And I think Zephyr Teachout's campaign ran on this anti-corruption. If people didn't know about it before, Zephyr hounded it into our voters. And when she came into our community, I think that was one of the messages that she brought. We got to take corruption out of government. And that's something for people who are looking at their brothers and sisters across the world who are fighting corruption in government and regimes. I think that it resonates with some folks. But I think for us, it's about issues. People want to see the New York State DREAM Act. And I think if Cuomo does have future political aspirations, these things have to go. Campaign finance reform, got to give people that look like me and look like communities of color in New York City the chance to run. This is something that's very important. Our campaign finance reform, New York State DREAM Act, the women's equality agenda, the entire agenda needs to pass. He's promised us that. He's promised to stomp ground for Democrats and get rid of the IDC. Let's see if that happens. I don't know.
Those are big question marks, which Michael brought up before as well. If I think there's a lot of skepticism about the IDC going anywhere.
And they said it wouldn't. I mean, if you listen carefully what Jeff Klein
Right.
said, he didn't say we're going out of business.
Right.
We'll join with the Democrats.
Realign.
We're still the IDC.
Right. Yeah, and that could make for all sorts of politics, of course, as we move forward. So speaking of sort of voter disillusionment, we're going to see one debate, it looks like, in each of these three statewide races. What is that? I mean, that seems like a problem to me.
Correct. Clearly, it's political campaign theory 101 that if you're an incumbent with a solid lead and lots of money and you have a little-known opponent, don't give your opponent a chance. And we have come to a point where it's become easier and easier to do that. And certainly in 2010, Andrew Cuomo played that very well with that one circus-like debate with 6 candidates and perhaps most memorable moment being his Republican opponent scurrying across the stage to hit the bathroom before the debate ended. That's really what people remember.
And he wasn't even an incumbent. He wasn't.
Correct, but he was
a favorite.
He wasn't in a commanding position.
Sure.
So here he's basically following the same playbook. There's a multi-candidate debate scheduled for the end of October. Rob Astorino, I think, did make a tactical mistake in that the governor, having ignored Astorino's invitations to debate and many invitations from established hosts, suddenly announced that he had accepted 2, one this multi-candidate debate and one a radio, not really a debate, but really a sequential interview. And Rob Astorino understandably was unhappy about that, but he did decline it ultimately. And I think that's muddied the effectiveness of his attacks against the governor for not agreeing to more debates.
Are there any things as the election day approaches, anything that's on your radar that you think we should be watching for? That there's obviously which we're not going to be able to get into Actually, in this segment, there's the three ballot proposals, which we encourage voters and viewers to check out. Find information online because that is going to be on your ballot. Are there anything on your radar that we might be surprised by, or that people should keep an eye out for as we approach, or is it pretty much just going to be sort of a steady glide into Election Day for these three statewide incumbents?
Well, I think the Estorino world hopes that there'll be some Moreland Commission development, but that's completely beyond their control or our control. Really, it's beyond anybody's control except for the United States Attorney. But beyond that, the list is pretty short, I think, of things that you can expect to have.
Do you expect anything to come out on that before Election Day?
No, I don't expect anything to come out. Nor do I expect turnout to be much higher than 10 to 12 or 15%. Like, what's driving people out to vote? And we also look at the fact that the state unions are opposed to the governor. They have no real reason to drive the members to vote.
And they drive turnout.
Yeah, and that drives turnout. Unions drive turnout. You'll see turnout driven maybe on a micro level at the state Senate level for those who really want to see the Democrats control or have the Republicans control. So you see turnout there. You have this race for Congress in Brooklyn, Staten Island, the grim
That's the race to watch.
recce race. That'd be interesting to watch, see how that turns out, because that'd be a bellwether to see whether or not that part of the city where you have real competitive elections, Republicans and Democrats, conservative Democrats could play a role in this as well, and that tells you something.
And and as you said, I mean, that race that is the only congressional seat representing New York City that is held by a Republican at this point could be a little bit of a boon for Rob Estorino if enough people are brought out by the Michael Grimm camp, and Manhattanites, I'm sure, and other viewers will be watching that. Yeah.
Well, paradoxically, even though Staten Island is thought of as predominantly Republican, and they do have a high number of Republican elected officials, it's actually a Democratic registration advantage by about 3 to 2. And many of those voters really are Cuomo-type voters.
A little more fiscal conservative, but socially, yeah, okay. Well, we're going to have to leave the conversation there, but I thank you for a great discussion. Thank you to John Kenny, Linda Sarsour, and Michael Benjamin for joining us today. If you want to learn more about the upcoming elections, you can visit GothamGazette.com or MNN.org for full coverage of upcoming races and issues. I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette for Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.